The Daily.
Now we're talking music. I love this bit on the show. About once a month we have a chat with Derek about some great music, and we're talking. We're going from those kind of Jerry and the Pacemakers, poppy pop bands that are around, which were great, you know, and people like Amen Corner and all that sort of stuff. And we hit 65, and we got the British invasion, of course, in the States, and this kind of rock music morphs into something that's going to last really for the next few decades at least, and it's probably still around today.
Absolutely. I mean, it was really pivotal time, this. I mean, before that, it had been very linear, the development in both the US and the UK.
Yeah.
In the US, sort of blues grew into R&B, rock and roll. Then it went into soul limbo, and the Brits got their act together with beat music, and the British invasion swept all before it. But in the UK, it had a similar but parallel route with trad jazz, which is the Brits' take on New Orleans jazz, that morphed into skiffle, British rock and roll. But we actually then... the British rock and roll morphed into beat music. People like the Beatles.
Yeah.
The standard two guitars, bass and drum combo with maybe a separate singer. And it's that basically morphed into rock. And what happened was the music became a lot more sophisticated and had a much harder edge. And one of the noticeable differences was, up until that time, life was very singles focused, which is why you find that 50s LPs and early 60s LPs are really quite collectible in good condition, because people weren't buying LPs, they were buying singles. But by the time you get to 65, and people like the Who with I Can't Explain, Small Faces with What You Gonna Do About It, it really started to move into a whole new world.
Looking at the American linear, the US blues went into R&B plus country music as well.
Yeah, you had a white influence that came in. The blues, R&B, jazz route was very much the black influence, but parallel you had the sort of hillbilly country music.
And Charlie Pride was in both of them.
and that sort of morphed into rockabilly, and then the two fused together.
Yeah. And of course, then you got the soul music running on another line, I suppose.
That's right.
And Motown, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But you put limbo, rock and roll into limbo.
Limbo was really when American rock and roll died out in the late 1950s. The main protagonists disappeared. I mean, Elvis was in the army.
Yeah.
Little Richard had found God.
Buddy Holly,
he renounced rock and roll.
Yeah.
Jerry Lee Lewis' rock and roll career imploded when it was discovered that the young lady on the British tour with him, the 13-year-old lady, was his wife, and more so was the daughter of his bass playing cousin. So his career imploded when he came over to the UK.
We lost Buddy Holly, of course, as well, didn't we?
And Buddy Holly died. What happened then in America, it sort of went off into different directions. You had Phil Spector, who emerged in the late 50s.
The Ronettes and all that,
Absolutely. You had the dance crazes, the twist, Chubby Checker and all that. Then there was a whole host of dances, the Popeye and the swim and all kinds of stuff, and surf music, of course.
And Frankie Avalon and Neil Sedaka, those sort of folks, weren't they? Like crooners, really, weren't they?
Well, exactly. I mean, that's where rock and roll went, was the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, young, clean-cut boys like Frankie Avalon. And really, well, you can't say there's nothing going on when Phil Spector music's happening. But basically, American music was not really developing, whereas the British music went into beat music, and a lot of the beat groups then went off to Hamburg. An awful lot of them sort of learnt their trade, sort of apprenticeship almost. But it was around 65 that it all started to change. I mean, the British invasion, where American acts couldn't get a look in, started to fade away. I mean, the Byrds, who'd been calling themselves the Beefeaters to sound English, they had their first hit with Mr. Tambourine Man. And bands like Jefferson Airplane, the Warlocks that became the Grateful Dead, and Velvet Underground over on the East Coast, they were all starting to gig. I mean, they weren't doing anything in terms of record sales for quite a while to come. But the point is, I mean, they were there.
Yeah, they were under the radar a little bit, but they were there,
Absolutely. And even Bob Dylan, I mean, on June the 15th, 1965, he recorded Like a Rolling Stone.
Yeah.
And that was a landmark, I think, in Dylan's development. And he had the infamous, one could say, Electric World Tour with the band backing him at that time.
Yeah.
although they were called the Hawks at that time. He played on July the 25th, 65, he played the Newport Folk Festival, which a lot of his die-hard folk fans felt was a betrayal because he had an electric band behind him.
But I mean, we always assume Bob Dylan's always been around, but it would have been quite unique, really, to have this singer-songwriter in that era just suddenly seemingly coming out of nowhere.
Well, that's right. I mean, he'd been around since the early 60s and beavering away on the protest front. He'd released 3 or 4 albums by the time he got to Like a Rolling Stone.
Yeah, because he wrote a Johnny Cash hit as well, didn't he? I've Got You, Babe, or something. No, I've Got You, Babe. Anyway,
I can't remember.
But he wrote a Johnny Cash song. So yeah, I mean, he was very much there and abouts. But his style of music really, like we say, wasn't heard of it under the Neil Sedaka's and the Frankie Avalons and the Chubby Checkers.
Exactly. I mean, it really started to develop. And the established supergroups were also around 65, 66 developing. I mean, in 66, the Stones released Aftermath, which is their first album with all Jagger Richard compositions. And that was very nearly called Could You Walk on Water? Yeah. But they decided in the end that, or I think the record company decided in the end that Aftermath would be a more appropriate title. And the Beach Boys, of course, released Pet Sounds, which is a big influence on Paul McCartney, particularly.
Good Vibrations and God Only Knows all that. Some great production work on those songs, weren't they? And great writing.
Unbelievable.
I remember, like you were saying, my mum and dad had a little yellow kind of singles holder with all the singles in. You got the Beatles in there and all the originals. They got rid of these, I can't believe it, all on vinyl. And they had 1 or 2 albums, and one of those albums was Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys.
It's brilliant album.
The original album, So I wish I'd still had it now.
And it'd be a very, very influential album. And the Beatles, of course, released Revolver, which is really starting to develop, and sort of psychedelic sound, special effects and stuff were really starting to come to the fore.
Nothing like She Loves You on there.
I know. Although Rubber Soul, of course, the previous album had been the first one with all Lennon-McCartney compositions. But they also played their last ever concert performance at San Francisco's Candlestick Park. They hadn't decided that they were not going to tour anymore and become a studio band.
Just the way it went.
It just worked that way. I mean, they had the interview with the Evening Standard, where John Lennon had said that they were more popular than Jesus, and when the original article was released in the UK, there wasn't a word of outcry. But when it was published in America in Dateline magazine, teen magazine, wow, there was some
burning albums and
Ku Klux Klan in the car parks, death threats, and they also, at the time, the technology wasn't what it is now, and they couldn't hear themselves. I mean, famously at Shea Stadium, you've seen numerous interviews where they said that they can't hear themselves on stage, and they just decided they'd become a studio band.
And so we're moving on then to the bands like The Doors and Move and Cream, of course. Some great bands coming out.
Absolutely. The Doors are a great example because they sort of were coming together as Rick and the Ravens when Jim Morrison did his first recording session with them. And then it wasn't, that was 2nd of September 65, but to give an idea of it, it wasn't until January the 4th, 1967, they released their first album and single.
I'm going to play a little bit of The Doors. Is that okay? We've literally got about a minute's worth of this because of time not allowing, but here we go. Well, there we go. It's sacrilege to cut in on them, but we're going to have to do it anyway. Light My Fire by The Doors, and I was just asking you off air then because it kind of remind me similar sound to the Animals. Where did the Animals come into this? Because they released some great kind of iconic songs, didn't they? Oh,
absolutely. I mean, the Animals had been one of the premier British R&B bands alongside people like the Yardbirds. But interestingly enough, I mean, their course or career had run its course by 1966. And when they were over in America doing their final tour, they split up there. And the bass player, Chas Chandler, was asked by a friend, I think it was Keith Richards' girlfriend, said, hey, you want to come to the Café War? and see this guy, this guitarist. He's amazing. And that, of course, was Jimi Hendrix. Yeah. At that point, spelled double M-Y. And Chas Chandler, wow, this is good. And I fancy becoming a manager. So he paid for him to come over to England and set him off on his career in England. Of course, Jimi Hendrix was one of the absolute icons of that era. And I think the thing to remember as well is when Jimi Hendrix's first album, Are You Experienced, came out, there was absolutely nothing like it. Beforehand. Yeah. It was awesome. I can remember I bought the album when it first came out. I jumped on a bus, because I played in a local band at the time, Cleo's Mood, and took it to the bass players. Buns, you've got to hear this. You've got to hear this, man. Yeah. And it was just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it sounds like it really affected and affected so many people at the time, of course. Yeah. So what about The Move, then?
Well, The Move's an interesting band because they've been... the people who came to... A bunch of about 5 guys in 3 different bands were in a particular pub in Birmingham one afternoon and one evening, and they decided, hey, why don't we all get together and form a new band? So Carl Wayne, Bev Bevan and Chris Kefford from Carl Wayne and the Vikings, Roy Wood from Mike Sheridan's Lot, and Trevor Burton from Danny King and the Mayfair Set got together and formed the Move. I think one of the premier bands of the time.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there's a great tie as well with Hendrix and Cream, which I think you could argue that Cream was the band in 1966 that very much started the whole rock thing. Because what they did, they put a whole new level. They took blues to a whole new level. But shortly after Hendrix came to England, he went to see Cream, because Cream had not long formed. And... he said, well, Chas Chandler, can you introduce me to Eric Clapton? So Chas Chandler persuaded the Cream to let Hendrix jam with them. I think he played in fact, they did. They played Killing Floor. And apparently Eric Clapton was well put out by the skill and showmanship of Jimi Hendrix. Well, he nearly gave up the guitar.
2 of the greatest guitarists in the world.
Oh, I mean, that was it. It was I can't remember which one now. It was an art college in London. This gig, but wow, two have been there because Hendrix, of course, had been going a long time. He'd sort of started several years earlier when he was in the army, formed bands and before he went in the army, he was in a couple of bands. But he used to play with people like Little Richard, Isley Brothers, Sam Cooke. Apparently Little Richard threw him out of his band because he was getting a little bit too much detention. I think Little Richard liked to be at the centre of it all.
We've got to round up, unfortunately, because of time, but let's maybe just quickly look at Pink Floyd, shall we, on the psychedelic rock scene that comes on.
I mean, they're a great example of a band from this time, because they've been together since about late 63, early 64 as an R&B covers band, with names like the T-Set and the Abdabs, the architectural Abdabs, because the guys were all at a lot of them were at architectural college. And by the time we get to 66, rock was then starting to develop into psychedelia as well. Yeah. I mean, psychedelic rock, the essence of that is to simulate LSD experiences, hallucinogenic
you can
drug
see the
experiences.
Effect of certain substances on the music industry at this point, can't you?
Oh, absolutely. Before that, it'd been mostly the sort of jazz musicians that have been down those particular routes. Yeah. But then they had their first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and that was an unbelievable album.
Fantastic. We moved to 67, The Summer of Love. Is that what does that bring? Because there's a whole kind of California sound that comes in as well, isn't there, at this point?
Oh, absolutely. And what happened was the psychedelic music really came into its own. You could argue the end of 67, psychedelic music was past its sell by date, as it were. But what was on the horizon there was prog rock, where prog was getting more and more and more sophisticated. And bands then, Deep Purple recorded with a full orchestra, Procol Harum famously recorded with a full orchestra. Guitar solos were going on for 20 minutes, drum solos, which only drummers enjoy. Now, I'm a drummer, so I love them. But not 20-minute drum solos, not everybody's cup of tea. No. And prog music was just taking it to more and more levels. And, of course, that's what led the groundwork for punk 4 or 5 years later, the excesses of the way rock developed. but I think this era of 65, 66 into 67, it's just a phenomenal
Very impressionable,
era.
What about glam rock? Where does that come in then?
Well, that comes in
They're too early 70s.
Yeah, early 70s, very much with people like T-Rex.
Yeah. Well, it's great reminiscing about. Well, I was never there, of course, because I was born in '76. But for me, I love this era and this great music. If anybody wants to find you online, Derek, how can they do that?
If you like all this, check out the website Rock'n'Roll Unravelled, and that's actually with 2 L's.
Yeah.
But I'm sure to find it either way.
Good stuff.
That's Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
And they can get the book as well. Yeah,
absolutely. All this information and the website's all based around the book Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
So get yourself a copy, dear listener.
And it's on Amazon. I checked it out. Amazon dots for Spain.
I'll have to maybe get an autograph off you after this then.
Absolutely.
Right. Thanks, Derek. Cheers.
I've enjoyed it. Cheers, mate.
Spring season programming on TRE.